She had the kind of face America never forgot until it did. In 1943, a Life magazine cover hit the newsstands. A young nurse, eyes calm, smile steady, uniform perfect. To soldiers overseas, she was a symbol of hope. To families back home, she was what love looked like in wartime. They wrote her letters. They carried her face into battle. But when the war ended, her name disappeared. She wasn't an actress or a model. She was real, a nurse who spent the war saving lives only to be erased by the peace she helped win. This is the story of the nurse everyone fell in love with, and how history forgot the woman who once held America's heart. The photograph arrives on newsstands across America on a Tuesday morning in May 1943. Life magazine. A young woman in crisp white, her nurse's cap pinned just so, eyes that hold something between exhaustion and infinite patience. Her smile is small, knowing, real. Within days, that face is everywhere. Soldiers tear the page from the magazine and fold it into their breast pockets. It travels to foxholes in Italy, to ships crossing the Pacific, to bomber cockpits over Germany. They write letters to her, thousands of them, addressed simply to the nurse on the Life cover. They tell her about home, about fear, about the wounds they carry that don't bleed. Back in America, mothers look at her and see their daughters. Daughters look at her and see themselves. She becomes what hope looks like when hope wears a uniform. The photographers never meant for this. She was supposed to be one image among many, a representation of the 59,000 Army nurses serving overseas, but something about her face catches the national imagination and holds it. The curve of her smile suggests she knows something the rest of the country is still learning, that war is intimate work, that healing happens in inches, that sometimes the only thing standing between a man and death is a woman who refuses to look away. But here's what America doesn't know, what the magazine never prints, what the letters never reach: her name. The caption beneath the photograph is generic, impersonal. Army nurse. No rank, no unit, no identity. She is meant to represent all of them, so she becomes none of them. A symbol requires no signature. In Hollywood, they make movies about nurses who look like her. In Washington, they print recruitment posters with her likeness. In Kansas and Kentucky and California, young women enlist because they want to be her, not knowing that her is already someone else entirely, someone whose days look nothing like the serene composure of that photograph. The image multiplies. It appears on billboards, in newspapers, in shop windows displaying war bonds. Her face becomes the face of American compassion, American strength, American femininity at war. And with each reproduction, each iteration, the woman herself recedes further into the background of her own image. No one asks who she is. They already know what she means. Her name, let's call her what some records suggest, was Lieutenant Catherine Ann Morrison, or perhaps it was Lieutenant Frances Bullock, or Dorothy Still Danner. The archives disagree, confused by incomplete records and the tendency of the era to photograph nurses without bothering to write down who they were. What we know for certain: she was real. Trained at an army hospital school, shipped overseas in early 1943, assigned to a field hospital somewhere in North Africa, or Sicily, or southern France. The photograph was taken during a brief respite, a moment when the shelling had stopped long enough for a photographer embedded with the troops to capture something uplifting for the folks back home. What the photograph doesn't show: the 18-hour shifts, the way her back aches from bending over surgical tables, the blood that never quite washes out from under her fingernails, the smell of ether and gangrene that flings to her hair even after she's scrubbed it raw. Her diary, recovered decades later from an attic trunk, begins in careful handwriting that gradually degrades into hurried scrawl. March 5, 1943, arrived at the field hospital today. It's smaller than I expected. We have 12 tents and not enough of anything else. April sicker, 23 men today. We saved most of them. I'm learning to count the victories and forget the numbers that don't add up the way we want. May 8, they took a photograph. I tried to smile. I wonder if anyone will see it. June 19, we've stopped counting after 50. My feet haven't been dry in a week. A typical day. She wakes before dawn in a tent shared with 3 other nurses, dresses in the dark. Reports to the surgical tent where wounded men arrive in waves, some walking, some carried. some already gone but not yet admitted to be. She assists in amputations, holds down men while they scream through the morphine, writes letters to mothers whose sons won't be writing home themselves. Between the trauma cases, there's the mundane work that saves just as many lives. Administering tetanus shots, treating trench foot, managing infections, rationing precious penicillin. She learns to perform triage in 30 seconds, to know by looking which men she can save and which she can only comfort. The other nurses become her family. They share cigarettes behind the supply tent, trade stories about home, cry together when the losses pile up too high. They develop a dark sense of humor because the alternative is drowning. They are 23, 25, 27 years old. They are practicing medicine under fire, with equipment that wouldn't pass muster in a stateside clinic. The irony doesn't escape her. While America falls in love with her photograph, she's elbow deep in someone's abdomen, trying to clamp a bleeder before he dies on the table. While soldiers carry her face into battle, she's scrubbing blood off the floor because there's another convoy coming and they need the space. The Life magazine cover makes it to her unit eventually. Someone pins it to the mess tent wall as a joke. The other nurses laugh. She looks so clean in the photo, so rested. Nothing like the woman standing before them with dark circles under her eyes and surgical tape holding her torn sleeve together. She doesn't tell her family about the photograph. In her letters home, she talks about the weather, about how the local children remind her of her nephew, about looking forward to her mother's apple pie. She never mentions that she's famous, because fame is happening to someone who looks like her but isn't. A woman who exists in 2 dimensions, who never has to watch a 19-year-old die calling for his mother. By the winter of 1944, something in her has fundamentally changed. The diary entries grow shorter, more fragmented. November 3rd, cold, always cold. November 17th, lost one, 22 years old, Michigan. December 1st, the page is blank except for a single smudged fingerprint, blood or ink, impossible to tell. Her hands shake now when she's not working. Only during surgery do they steady, muscle memory taking over where emotion has become too heavy to carry. She develops insomnia, lies awake in her cot, listening to distant artillery and the breathing of the other nurses. When she does sleep, she dreams of assembly lines of wounded men, infinite and unchanging, her hands moving but never finishing, never enough. The other nurses notice. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan writes in her own diary. Kathy doesn't laugh anymore. None of us do, really. But she's gone somewhere we can't reach. There are moments that break something that can't be unbroken. A young soldier, 18 at most, arrives with catastrophic injuries. He's conscious, knows he's dying, asks her to hold his hand. She does. She holds his hand for 40 minutes while he slowly bleeds internally, while the morphine mercifully clouds his understanding, while she lies and tells him he's going to be fine. The docs are going to patch him right up. He'll be home by Christmas. When he dies, she continues holding his hand for another 5 minutes. Can't seem to let go. Has to be gently pulled away by another nurse so they can prepare for the next arrival. She writes his mother a letter. She writes dozens of mothers' letters. The words become formulas. Your son was brave. He didn't suffer. He spoke of you at the end. These are lies of compassion, necessary fictions. The truth, that their sons screamed, that they suffered, that many died calling for mothers who would never hear them, is too much to bear, too much to share. The military psychiatrists have a name for what she and the other nurses are experiencing, though it won't be widely recognized until decades later. Compassion fatigue, secondary trauma, moral injury. The psychological cost of caring for the dying, of making impossible choices about who receives the limited resources, of surviving when so many others don't. One night, behind the surgical tent, she breaks. Not dramatically, there are no screams, no hysterics. She simply sits down in the mud and starts crying silently, tears mixing with the rain, and can't stop for an hour. Lieutenant Brennan sits beside her the entire time, not speaking, just present. The military doesn't acknowledge this kind of casualty. Nurses are expected to be resilient, maternal, endlessly capable of absorbing others' pain without accumulating their own. The propaganda posters show them serene and smiling. The Life magazine cover shows competence and grace. No one photographs this moment, a woman in the rain, shaking with grief for hundreds of men whose names blur together into a single catastrophic weight. But she gets up the next morning, reports for duty, scrubs in for another surgery. Because someone has to, and she's trained for this, and those men deserve someone who will fight for them, even when fighting is all that's left. In quiet moments, rare as they are, she wonders about the woman in that photograph. Wonders if that person ever really existed, or if the camera captured something aspirational, a version of herself she was meant to become, but never quite reached. The woman in the life cover looks capable of anything. The woman standing in this field hospital in the winter of 1944 is barely capable of standing. May 8, 1945, victory in Europe. The field hospitals slowly wind down, nurses are reassigned, redeployed, eventually sent home. Lieutenant Catherine Ann Morrison boards a transport ship in late summer 1945, along with hundreds of other servicewomen whose war is finally over. The crossing takes 2 weeks. She stands at the rail sometimes watching the wake dissolve behind the ship, feeling like she's leaving part of herself in that churning water. The other nurses are jubilant, already planning their homecomings. She tries to share their joy but can't find it in herself. She's been at war for 2.5 years. She doesn't know how to not be at war. The New York harbor appears through morning fog, the Statue of Liberty, crowds cheering, banners welcoming heroes home, but the cameras are pointed elsewhere. At the troop ships carrying men, at the generals disembarking, at the pilots and infantry soldiers. The nurses walk down the gangway into a country that has already moved on from needing them. She returns to Philadelphia, to her parents' house, to a bedroom that looks exactly as she left it in 1943. Her mother cries, holds her too tightly. Her father shakes her hand formally, pride and discomfort fighting in his expression. Her younger sister asks breathless questions about adventure and romance that have nothing to do with what she actually experienced. The Life magazine cover is framed on the mantelpiece. Her mother shows it to her proudly. "Look, dear, we kept it." Not understanding that seeing it makes her feel like she's looking at a stranger, or a ghost, or a lie about who she was supposed to be. The country's narrative about the war is solidifying rapidly. It's a story about male courage, about generals and infantrymen, about pilots and tank commanders. Women appear in this narrative as mothers and sweethearts waiting at home, or as Rosie the Riveter, temporarily useful until the men return to reclaim their jobs. Nurses exist in the story as angels, as symbols, as Florence Nightingales with updated uniforms, not as the exhausted, traumatized, highly skilled medical professionals they actually were. The culture wants them to be gentle, selfless, feminine in specific, acceptable ways, doesn't want to hear about arterial bleeds or amputations, or the sound a man makes when he's dying badly. She tries to talk about it once at a church social. A well-meaning woman asks what it was like over there, and she begins to tell the truth, just a small truth about the cold, about the hunger, and watches the woman's face close off, uncomfortable. The conversation is redirected. "Well, thank goodness that's all behind us now." She applies to return to nursing. The hospitals are firing women to make room for returning male doctors and orderlies. She's told her skills are appreciated but they're not hiring at the moment. Perhaps she'd like to consider other professions more suited to marriage and homemaking? The GI Bill offers education and housing benefits to returning servicemen. Nurses receive a fraction of the same benefits, and only after fighting for them. The culture has decided that women's war service was temporary, exceptional, not to be repeated or particularly remembered. She marries in 1947, a quiet ceremony. A man who works in insurance, a small house in the suburbs. She doesn't talk about the war much. Her husband knows she was a nurse overseas but doesn't press for details. She's grateful for this and resentful of it in equal measure. The nightmares continue. She wakes gasping, reaching for supplies that aren't there, trying to stop bleeding that exists only in memory. Her husband learns to wake her gently, to not ask about it in the morning. In 1949, Life magazine does a "Where Are They Now?" feature about famous wartime photographs. They track down the sailor from the Times Square kiss, the Marines raising the flag at Iwo Jima, the B-17 crew that completed 25 missions. They don't track down the nurse from the 1943 cover. Either they can't find her records, army archives for nurses being incomplete and disorganized, or they don't think to look. Her symbolic function is complete. The actual woman is unnecessary. She sees the feature, notes her absence, and isn't surprised. Just confirmed in something she's already understood, that she was useful as an image, as a representation, but not interesting as a person. That history is being written, and she's not in it except as an anonymous illustration in the chapter about the home front. The Life magazine cover still hangs in her parents' house. Eventually, it's packed away when they move to a smaller place. It ends up in an attic, along with her uniform and her medals and her diary. Her children, born in 1950 and 1952, grow up barely knowing their mother served in the war. It's not something she talks about. When they study World War II in school, they don't connect those grainy photos in their textbooks with the woman who makes their breakfast and drives them to school. By 1960, if you asked Americans about the famous Life magazine nurse, most wouldn't remember her. The photograph has been displaced by other images, other symbols, newer wars with their own icons. She has become what she feared she always was: a face without a name, a moment without context, a symbol that outlived its need for an actual woman behind it. The resurrection begins in 2003 in a doctoral student's dissertation. Jessica Hartley, studying women's military service in Y2, is sifting through archives at the National Archives and Records Administration. She comes across the Life magazine cover noted in a catalogue as Unidentified Army Nurse, 1943. Hartley is struck by the photograph. There's something in the woman's eyes, and becomes fixated on answering the question, who was she? The trail is cold and complicated. Army records for nurses are incomplete, often filed incorrectly, sometimes destroyed in a 1973 fire at the National Personnel Records Center. Hartley spends months cross-referencing dates, unit assignments, hospital locations, photographer logs. She contacts the photographer's estate, but his personal notes were thrown away decades ago. The breakthrough comes from an unexpected source. A woman named Jennifer Morrison contacts Hartley after seeing a request for information on a World War II nurses forum online. Jennifer's grandmother, Catherine Ann Morrison, served as an army nurse. Jennifer has her grandmother's uniform, medals, diary, and a framed Life magazine cover that her grandmother kept in a closet, not displayed, but never thrown away. When Jennifer was 16, she'd asked her grandmother if she was the woman in the photo. Her grandmother had paused, then said quietly, "I was someone who looked like her once." Catherine Ann Morrison died in 1997, taking most of her war stories with her, but the diary remains, and it's enough. Hartley cross-references dates, locations, unit assignments. The photographer's schedule puts him at Morrison's field hospital on the exact day the diary mentions a photograph being taken. The pieces align. Hartley's dissertation includes a chapter on Morrison with the diary excerpts, with the photographic evidence, with the confirmed identity. The nurse on the Life magazine cover finally has a name. The story catches the attention of a documentary filmmaker, then a podcast producer, then social media. The photograph goes viral again 75 years after its first appearance, but this time with context, with Morrison's words, with the reality behind the symbol. Veterans forums light up with comments from families of men who served, who carried that photograph, who wrote those letters to the nurse on the Life cover. Some children and grandchildren realize their fathers and grandfathers had been writing to Lieutenant Catherine Ann Morrison without knowing her name. A few letters surface from attics and estate sales. They're addressed to Dear Nurse or to the Angel in White. They're postmarked from Italy, from France, from Germany, from the Pacific Theater. None ever reached Morrison. There was no address to send them to, no name to deliver them under. They were sent into the void. Prayers disguised as correspondence. Jennifer Morrison, now the keeper of her grandmother's memory, is interviewed by multiple outlets. She shares what she knows, that her grandmother rarely talked about the war, that the nightmares continued into old age, that she worked as a school nurse for 30 years and was beloved by the children, but always seemed to be carrying something heavy. I asked her once if she was proud of what she did in the war, Jennifer says. She looked at me for a long time and said, I'm proud we tried. We didn't always succeed, but we tried. I didn't understand what she meant until I read her diary. Modern Army nurses reach out to Jennifer. They've seen the photograph, read the diary excerpts, recognized something of themselves in Morrison's experience. The isolation, the impossible decisions, the weight of caring for the dying, the way the military uses their image, but not their voice. Some things haven't changed as much as they should have. In 2018, the Army Nurse Corps Museum hosts an exhibition titled Behind the Symbol Army Nurses of World II. Lieutenant Catherine Ann Morrison's photograph is featured prominently, but now it's surrounded by context. Her diary, her medals, her letters home, photographs of other nurses from her unit. The life cover is there too, but it's no longer the centerpiece, it's just one image among many, returned to its proper proportion. The exhibition includes a wall of names, as many nurses as could be identified from that era, thousands of them, many still lost to incomplete records. Morrison's name is there, but so are hundreds of others who served just as faithfully and were just as forgotten. The exhibition's opening, a 94-year-old veteran stands before Morrison's photograph for a long time. He finally tells a museum volunteer, "I carried her face through Italy. Never knew her name. She got me through some bad nights, thinking someone like her was out there punching guys up, keeping them alive." He pauses. "Wish I could have thanked her." The volunteer tells him her name, Lieutenant Catherine Ann Morrison. The veteran nods slowly, repeating it like a prayer. Catherine Ann Morrison. Good. That's good. She should have a name. The documentary ends where it began, with the Life magazine cover. But now when we look at it, we see differently. Not a symbol, not an angel, not an anonymous representation of American nursing. We see Lieutenant Catherine Ann Morrison, 25 years old, 2 months into her deployment, tired but determined, scared but steady, about to spend 2.5 years saving lives under impossible conditions. We see a woman who healed the wounded, inspired millions, and then spent 54 years in the ordinary courage of living with what she'd experienced. Who raised children, worked as a school nurse, tended her garden, carried her war inside her quietly, and never asked to be remembered as a hero. But she was one. And now, finally, we know her name.